Hello, friends, and welcome to Jewels of Truth. My name is Daniel Fontenot. Is America a Christian nation? That has been the claim made by many people for over 100 years, and it is still, especially today, is being made. So today I want to read a part of a book entitled Answers, let me get this right, Answers to Objections by Francis D. Nichol. And so he has a chapter in his book. Actually, it's in the appendix 1, or is it appendix, not 1, but let's see. Yeah, anyway, it's in the appendix, page 866, and it is entitled How to Meet the Christian Nation Argument. So let's see what he says. I think he makes some very, very good points in this chapter in the appendix in regards to that issue. In America, one of the premises on which Sunday law advocates build is that this is a Christian nation, and therefore Sunday legislation is not only defensible, but imperative if Christian standards are to be reflected through the activities of the government. At first, the argument in support of the Christian nation claim was rather vague and of this order. Christian people founded the country, some of them coming here for religious reasons. The moral principles of Christianity are woven into our customs and laws. The oath is administered in the name of God. Sunday is excluded from the count of days in determining certain judicial matters, cognizance thus being taken of its distinctive character. These and like reasons were originally offered in proof that this is a Christian nation, and hence should protect Sunday with legislation. Then came the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1892 in what is known as the Holy Trinity Church case, in which the statement is made that, quote, this is a Christian nation. The case dealt with the right of that church to import a minister from abroad. Lower courts had ruled that this violated a law forbidding the import of foreign labor. The Supreme Court reasoned that the legislators never intended to include religious groups or individuals in the restrictive law, and supported this reasoning by showing that from earliest days the people of this country had acknowledged God as supreme and had sought to do his will. After citing declarations as far back as the commission of Ferdinand and Isabella to Columbus, the court declared, quote, these and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation, unquote. And that's from 143 U.S. 457. How far the justices intended the logic of their statement to be carried is not evident from that decision. They there invoked the Christian nation claim only to create a reasonable presumption that the legislators never intended to include ministers in their law against foreign labor. Thus, strictly speaking, the reasoning that climaxed in the conclusion that this is a Christian nation is really not the decision of the court, but is, in legal parlance, an arbiter dictum, a kind of parenthetical observation. The court was not ruling on the question of whether this is or is not a Christian nation, but on whether the Church of the Holy Trinity had violated a labor law. However, Sunday law reformers did not trouble themselves over legal niceties. They had their own convictions as to the implications of the Christian nation statement. In the organ of the National Reform Association appeared this exuberant comment, quote, "This is a Christian nation. That means Christian government, Christian laws, Christian institutions, Christian practices, Christian citizenship. And this is not an outburst of popular passion or prejudice. Christ did not lay his guiding hand there upon the calm, dispassionate, supreme judicial tribunal of our government. It is the weightiest, the noblest, the most tremendously far-reaching in its consequences of all the utterances of that sovereign tribunal. And that utterance is for Christianity, for Christ. A Christian nation, then this nation is Christ's nation, for nothing can be Christian that does not belong to him. Then his word is its sovereign law. Then the nation is Christ's servant. Then it ought to and must confess, love, and obey Christ." And that's from the Christian Statesman of November 19th, 1892. This quotation reveals how far-reaching were the conclusions that the reformers drew from the words of the Supreme Court. Of course, these reformers were chiefly and immediately concerned to find support for Sunday laws. Charity toward them requires us to believe that they did not truly see what their bubbling rhetoric could lead to. Zealots and reformers are rarely given to dispassionate, calm, and logical analysis. They are inclined rather to seize with fervor whatever appears to support their cause, without troubling to inquire whether it may prove to be a broken reed that will pierce them. Seventh-day Adventists have consistently argued that the national reformers, in reasoning as they did, logically gave to the state a religious character and caused its statutes to appear as springing from the mind of God and a holy people. Hence, to rebel against the state or against any of its laws would be tantamount to rebelling against the will of God. But if that be so, it is pointless for a citizen to set up his individual conscience against any mandate of the state. Is it not presumptuous for anyone to say that God, speaking to him through his conscience, forbids him to obey a law of a Christian nation? Does God contradict himself? In other words, we have consistently held that the logic of the Christian nation premise leads inevitably to a revival of the medieval doctrine that the king can do no wrong. How plausibly, in bygone centuries, that claim was made. Did not God set up the king? Does not the Bible declare that he is the minister of God? The peasant in those days of the divine right of kings could not hope to make a case in court by arguing that his conscience forbade him in obeying a law of the king. The argument had no standing. Adventists have often wondered whether the Supreme Court might someday interpret its own words and reveal what are the logical conclusions that follow from the loose, though sweeping observation that, quote-unquote, this is a Christian nation. The Holy Trinity Church case was decided in 1892. In the year 1931, the Supreme Court handed down a decision in the case of Dr. Douglas Clyde McIntosh, who had applied for citizenship with a reservation regarding the bearing of arms. Dr. McIntosh reserved the right to let his conscience tell him whether he ought to bear arms in a particular war that might be fought. In ruling against his application, the court reasoned in the following manner, quote, when he speaks of putting his allegiance to the will of God above his allegiance to the government, it is evident in the light of his entire statement that he means to make his own interpretation of the will of God the decisive test which shall conclude the government and stay its hand. We are a Christian people, according to one another the equal rights of religious freedom, and acknowledging with reverence the duty of obedience to the will of God. But also we are a nation with the duty to survive, a nation whose constitution contemplates war as well as peace, whose government must go forward upon the assumption and safety can proceed upon no other, that unqualified allegiance to the nation and submission and obedience to the laws of the land, as well as those made for war, as those made for peace, are not inconsistent with the will of God." Unquote. The same Christian statesman that in 1892 had given such fulsome praise to the Supreme Court for its declaration that this is a Christian nation, joined the chorus of the religious press in denunciation of the court in 1931 with these scathing words, quote, "Just now the American people have been rudely awakened to the fact that this liberty of conscience for the individual citizen is threatened at least by making its surrender one of the conditions for becoming a citizen by naturalization. In this case, the federal government has officially declared that it has the power to decide when and in what circumstances it may, under the plea of necessity, override the conscience of the individual citizen. Carried into the realm of actual citizenship, this would abolish the right of the individual to judge of the righteousness of the acts of the government he has helped to create and of his own active participation in them. It requires but logic and the ruthlessness born of excitement to march from this premise straight to all the conclusions of the state sovereignty of Soviet Russia." That's from the Christian Statesman of July and August 1931. Nowhere in this fervent defense of the individual conscience does the Christian Statesman reveal that it is aware that the court had used the national reformers' favorite Christian nation phrase as the basis for its decision against McIntosh. The reformers observed that the court's decision gave the government the power to override the conscience of the individual citizen. But the court contended not only that the state has the power, but also the right, and that this right rests upon the premise that unqualified allegiance to the nation and submission and obedience to the laws of the land are not inconsistent with the will of God. This is but another way of saying that the laws of the land are not inconsistent with the will of God. And of course, this leads on to the far-reaching but inevitable conclusion that the citizen is to discover what is the will of God for him, not by searching his heart and conscience, but by examining the laws and statute books of the state. I hope here, because there's a lot of reading, of course, in here, and I apologize for that, but if you have followed this, you see that back in what year was it? 1892, that this same periodical, the Christian Statesman, it was all for, the Supreme Court's decision that this is a Christian nation. But when that same Supreme Court ruled against a later case in which it was using the very same decision of 1892 to deny this man who was seeking for citizenship from another country, okay? They said, no, you can't be allowed into this country because you're going to decide for yourself whether you should obey the laws of this land or not. I hope you see the inconsistency there, because in 1931, the Christian statesman, just in a different situation, then actually was against the Supreme Court's decision, using the same in 1892 that the Supreme Court used in 1892. And why may not the court thus reason if it really believes that this is a Christian people? If this or any other nation is truly Christian, if as a state it possesses not only a political but a religious character, the Christian nation at that, then it may plausibly be argued that the laws of the land are not inconsistent with the will of God. Indeed, only on the premise that this is a Christian nation, and thus guiding its course by the standards of heaven, could it possibly be contended that the laws of the land are not inconsistent with the will of God. The national reformers were happy to declare that the Supreme Court acted under the guiding hand of Christ when it said in the Holy Trinity case that this is a Christian nation. In fact, they declared at the time that the court's statement in that case actually established that this is a Christian nation. But when this same Supreme Tribunal later quoted the Trinity case and went on to reason that citizens should give unquestioning obedience to the laws of the state, the reformers were ready to pillory the court. But how did the reformers know that Christ guided the court in the first instance, but not in the second? Are the national reformers better able to decide what are the ultimate conclusions that may logically be drawn from a statement of the Supreme Court than is the court itself? It is evident that the only way to escape the conclusion reached by the court in the McIntosh case is to set down the counter view that, quote, unqualified allegiance to the nation and submission and obedience to the laws of the land, unquote, may in certain instances be wholly, quote, inconsistent with the will of God, unquote. But to maintain this position, we must surrender the view that the nation is Christian. That is the dilemma that has confronted the national reformers ever since the Supreme Court decision in the McIntosh. Turning aside now from this devastating Supreme Court commentary on the famous Christian nation phrase, let us explore a little further the statements made by the national reformers in their historic pronouncement of 1892. We shall see that their reasoning contains other fallacies than those exposed by the Supreme Court decision in the McIntosh case. In 1892, they came to the sweeping conclusion that because this is a Christian nation, quote, this nation is Christ's nation, for nothing can be Christian that does not belong to him. Then his word is its sovereign law. Then the nation is Christ's servant. Then it ought to and must confess, love, and obey Christ, unquote. The national reformers appear to have made this statement to protect themselves against a question that clamors for expression. Why call this country Christian when its citizenry in general are anything but Christian? Let us examine the statement. If we should say to a man, you are now a Christian, therefore you ought to and must confess, love, and obey Christ, our words would need explaining to avoid most serious error. If we meant simply that the man was to continue such a relationship to Christ, well and good. But if we meant that because he had been pronounced a Christian, he must therefore begin to relate himself thus to Christ, we would be guilty of turning the Christian program upside down. It is because a man confesses, loves, and is willing to obey Christ that he becomes a Christian. Now, the national reformers were unable to say in 1892 that the nation could be pronounced Christian on the ground that it had been confessing, loving, and obeying Christ. So they were obliged to work from the opposite end, affirming first that the nation is Christian and then telling it that it ought to and must act Christian. The reformers made that statement more than half a century ago. Now, this book, the last copyright was like in the 1950s, so it's an old book. So this is more than a century ago. Okay, 1892 is whenever they proclaimed this a Christian nation. So the reformers made that statement more than half a century ago, or a century ago. Will they contend that the nation has, during those years, changed its ways as it ought to, and justified the pronouncement as to its national Christianity? I hardly think they would have the hardihood to attempt to prove this. The fact of the increasing problem of crime and of disregard for law on the part of the citizenry at large is too generally known. Those who sought to give political guidance to millions of men in 2 world wars declare that the nation is largely pagan. If after half a century the nation has failed to conform to Christianity as it ought to, but instead has become only worse, is it not about time that all those who truly love the name Christian protest against the hypocrisy of the phrase Christian nation? The nation has not been improved by the magic of the famous phrase, and certainly the beautiful word Christian has received no added richness of meaning from being thus combined with nation. But perhaps the national reformers may contend that although it is true that national conditions have become only worse during the years, nevertheless the title Christian nation could still be retained, because as a result of reforms that they will launch, the nation will finally do what it ought to. In reply, it might be said that the title never should have been given in the first place, not only because, as a matter of fact, the nation is not Christian in its conduct, but because the state cannot properly have a religious character. Nevertheless, let us consider this final argument in defense of the notable phrase. Can the national reformers point to any nation that has been nationally reformed? We read much of the decline and fall of empires, morally as well as politically, but scarcely a word of their revolution. And if after half a century and more of active endeavor by the national reformers, the country morally, reason can we offer as to why we should believe we can reform it throughout in the Can they do what earnest contenders for Christian principles have been unable to do in any other nation or century? Surely history does not warrant the belief that the nation at large will ever do what it ought to. Should we nevertheless continue to describe it as Christian solely because it ought to do that which it never has and never may be expected to do as a nation? If so, then words have lost their distinctive meaning, and we can properly call a man Christian who for half a century has steadily sunk lower morally, not because we believe he is confessing, loving, and obeying Christ, but because we believe he ought to. And that is an answer to the claim that this is a Christian nation. So I hope this, because I mean this subject is going to come up sooner or later, especially when this nation presumes to enforce religious laws in this country. So if you have enjoyed this presentation, this reading, then we would encourage you to tap that like button so that it can be sent far and wide to those who are hungering for the truth. And if you have any questions or comments, we would encourage you to post these comments or questions at the bottom of this video. And if you haven't subscribed, we would encourage you to do that today. So we thank you for joining us here at Jewels of Truth, and we hope and pray that you will have a good day in the Lord.